Do you want to get us going on this?
I don't know the subject well enough.
Okay.
Interested to hear
Okay, well, I'll talk to you then. Now, frog in my throat this morning, but I'm going to talk about one subject, and that is the situation in Venezuela and the attempt to overthrow the government in Venezuela. Are you okay on the sound? Yeah. So this week, the last couple of days, how you doing, all right? You'll be able to see on the news, on the television, they're talking about Venezuela and the new government of Venezuela, or the new president of Venezuela. Basically on Wednesday, there was a rally in Caracas, about maybe 100,000 people turned up, not particularly huge rally. And at that rally against the government, the head of the National Assembly declared himself to be the president of Venezuela. Quite an unusual event. After all, you don't normally become president of a country by declaring yourself to be that president, but so it was. And actually, the president of Venezuela, the official president of Venezuela, was inaugurated on the 10th of January this year, after an election took place last year on the 20th of May, in which he was elected, Nicolas Maduro this is, was elected with 67.8% of the vote. His opponent received about 27% of the vote. The former Prime Minister of Spain, his name Zapatero, former Socialist Prime Minister of Spain, was present at the elections in May last year. He was an electoral observer, and he declared, this is the former president of Spain, Prime Minister of Spain, declared that the election in Venezuela was free and fair. Now, certain people have been spreading stories that, that the Venezuelan government is undemocratic and somehow carried out a fraudulent election. For example, one of the present government ministers, by the name of Hunt, declared that the ballot boxes in Venezuela were stuffed by false ballots. Now, this is a minister in the British government. The problem with that lies in that in Venezuela, they don't have, well, they do have ballot papers, but the only ballot paper you get is when you've already voted. You vote in Venezuela with your fingerprint. You can only vote once because you only got one fingerprint. You vote once and then you get a ballot paper to back up the votes you've already placed. So the idea that you could stuff ballots is a complete and absolute lie, coming from the British government. The European leaders, all of them with the exception of the Greeks, have declared yesterday that Venezuela must call for new elections within 8 days. Otherwise, unspecified actions other than the European governments will apparently approve of the self-proclaimed claim of this guy Juan Guaido, declaring himself to be the president of Venezuela. Now, I ask you this. When has any country submitted to the demands of America, Canada, and Europe that the government be changed, that they call elections after elections have been held last May, recognised by the former Prime Minister of Spain, and yet they're supposed to call new elections because the Americans, that's what it is, Donald Trump, Mike, what's his name, Pence, this other guy, Pompeo, 2 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, they said the president of Venezuela should no longer be accepted, and instead of this, a new president should be imposed. And they mentioned Pompeo at the time. Pompeo at that time said he was willing to become president. But suddenly, a change of tack after the Americans plotted and organized this campaign. Suddenly on Wednesday, he declares himself president. On what constitutional authority? On what grounds can he claim to be president of Venezuela? And yet, now there are many people, my friend here will turn around and say, well, Venezuela's in terrible economic condition. Yes, there are bad economic conditions in Venezuela. Does that mean that every time, therefore, that there are bad economic conditions in a country, you overthrow the government, install a new president, and put your own American stooge in power? That's what's happening in Venezuela. Now, let me give a bit of background. Sorry?
If it's the president's fault, you might consider that.
The president's fault, you might consider what?
The economy went down.
If it's the president's fault that the economy went down, what might you consider?
Replacing him.
You might consider replacing him. By what means?
Don't know.
In a democracy, by what means
question.
do you remove a president? Last year, there was a presidential election on the 20th of May. Why did that presidential election happen? It wasn't the term of office. It was because the opposition had gained enough signatures to call for a new election. Venezuela, unlike Britain, has a legally enshrined in their constitution the right to recall a president, the right to call an election if you're dissatisfied with the president. They did that in Venezuela last year on the 20th of May. That was a recall election. The Venezuelan president, like him or not, Nicolas Maduro, won that vote by 67.8%. Now, after that period, May until January, in January the 10th was the inauguration date from the president elected last year, re-elected last year. So the democratic process to remove the president has already been engaged in. If you want to remove the president of Venezuela, you can collect signatures. I believe it's 20% of the voters, eligible voters, and then you will get another recall referendum. So why is it that it's okay in that society suddenly to call for somebody else completely unconstitutionally to be president? Because the Americans say so.
Well, if the conditions get so bad that people can have a revolution, the army can take over the government.
What you just said is interesting.
It's not democratic.
I agree, just the same as in the American Constitution. If the government really refuses to do anything that the people want, in America you have the right, ultimately, which is why you got the right to bear arms, to overthrow the government, right? Now, if in Venezuela there was such a scenario that there was really a mass movement of the people to overthrow the government, I would accept your position. However, where is this mass movement? Where is it? This guy declared himself to be president in front of a crowd. The best estimates put it at about 100,000. Now, Caracas is a city of many million, and yet 100,000 people, one guy declares himself president. Is that supposed to be a revolution? Where is the revolution? When he declared himself president, within minutes, Donald Trump had sent a message, you are the legitimate president. Now, as far as I know, that is not the method by which presidents in Venezuela or anywhere else in the world are appointed, elected or removed. And there is and was no revolution against Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. There is no revolution. Yesterday, Guaido, this guy who claims he's president, took to the streets of Caracas to hold a rally after this so-called revolution had happened. You know how many people were there? Look on the BBC website. It says hundreds of people attended a rally. Hundreds of people. That's what we have here. Hundreds of people in Hyde Park. Hardly a revolution. And so what we have happening in Venezuela is a coup d'etat organized by America, backed by the European Union, those paragons of democracy, backed by Jeremy Hunt, that defender of democracy, backed by governments in the Western world, and backed by the extreme right-wing leader of Brazil and the leaders of Argentina, what they call the Lima group of countries, 11 out of 14 of them, declaring from outside the country who should be president of a sovereign, independent country. No country on earth that claims to be in any way democratic could tolerate the overthrow of their government by diktat from the European Union, from America, or from Canada. Who the hell are they to tell the people of Venezuela who their president is? Who the hell do they think they are?
They're all starving in Venezuela.
Sorry?
They're all starving. No bread, no medicine.
But what about
I'll come on to that in 1
the
second.
3 million people who have left Venezuela?
Yeah.
Well, they haven't gone for their holidays, have they?
Well, that's right.
Why?
Venezuela has had 2 periods under the Bolivarian government. Let's go back to understand what happened. In 1998, Hugo Chavez was elected as president of Venezuela. At that time, he got about 55% of the vote. He called 13 different elections in the period he was in power, from 1998 until 2013, when he died as president of Venezuela. He was elected 13 times. They had elections to back that revolution. And what they did was, in a country with the largest supplies of oil in the world, what they did was, unlike all the previous governments in Venezuelan history, they transferred resources from the oil industry to provide healthcare, education, housing, welfare, schools, hospitals, infrastructure. They provided the people.
Bigger mess than
What is the evidence for this? There was something in the
inflation, million
1990s. We're coming back to the actually in 1 second. I said, what is the historical background?
Yes. I understand.
Venezuela achieved its Millennium Goals long before any other country on earth. That is improvements in healthcare, welfare, and social services. In my view, the reason for the crisis economically in Venezuela lies in something quite different. And that is, they have oil in Venezuela, but the production of machinery, equipment, agriculture, and so on is very poor. I visited Venezuela in 2004, just after a coup d'etat had happened in Venezuela in 2002, organized by America, which was defeated by the people. And what happened was, the Venezuelans, they have this resource and this resource only, oil. And I ask you this, look around the world at the oil countries. Oil is a benefit, a gift of God, if you like, but it is also a curse. Why? Because if your country only has oil and it pours out of the earth and provides the cars, it's cheaper in Venezuela to fill your car with petrol than to buy a bottle of water. Cheaper in Venezuela to fill your car with petrol than to buy a bottle of water. Now, what is the consequence of that? It meant that throughout the 20th century, Venezuelan elites simply lived from the oil revenue. They were white, Spanish origin, and linked in with the United States of America. They spent half their lives in Miami and half their lives in Venezuela. So the wealthy elite lived off the wealth that came out of the earth. They gave nothing to the indigenous people. They gave nothing to the mixed blood people. The majority of the Venezuelan people lived in shanty towns, and a tiny elite, Italian and Spanish origin, had all the wealth of the country. Hugo Chavez came to power democratically, and he tried to take part of the oil money and to give it to the poor. He gave it to healthcare, education, welfare. However, because he did not wish to smash the power of the old elite that controlled that wealth, because he had so much money, he thought, I can give to the poor and I can pacify the rich. I can keep them happy, let them have their yachts, their boats, their houses, their holidays in Miami, let them have their wealth, and at the same time we'll give wealth to the poor. The problem was this idea of a compromise between the elite and the people could not work for this reason. And I saw it myself. If you go in Caracas to the area called Altamira, Altamira is an extremely wealthy enclave. Everybody in the wealthy classes in Venezuela has got maids, servants, gardeners, cooks, cleaners in their house.
Have they left now?
Now, what happened was, under Chavez, these people, poor, uneducated, exploited, generally black or mixed blood, these people suddenly were empowered to demand their rights. So what did it mean? It meant if you're a multi-millionaire and you've got a big house with a swimming pool, a large garden, a yacht, and so on, the captain of your yacht, no longer, when you went like this, vodka and tonic, no longer did they run. When you said to your gardener, cut the lawn now, they said, I'll cut it in 5 minutes. When they said to their cook, this food is not good, the cook said, make your fucking own. Right?
Stuff it up your arse.
And therefore all the money that they had, even under Chavez, when their wealth increased, the elite wealth increased under Chavez. But even though this happened, they had lost their power over the people. They were horrified. They were outraged. They were disgusted. Why are we losing our power? It's like cutting off a man's penis. They lost their authority, their power, their control over those below them. And for this was horror, disgust, destruction of their world. And therefore, again and again and again, they mobilized violence, terrorism. There was a couple of years ago, you remember, there was an army captain, dropped a hand grenade to try and overthrow the government. I believe it was on the Electoral Commission. This morning, the newspaper's got a story. The story is a colonel has joined the rebellion. Who is the colonel? He's inside the Venezuelan embassy in America. Who organized the declaration of the new president of Venezuela? The Americans. Within seconds of him declaring, they already said they support him, which means they had planned it in advance. In 2002, there was a coup. In April 2002, 12th of April, 14th of April. You remember they captured Chavez. There's the best documentary film on politics of all time. Look it up. It's called The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. It's about what happened then. And when you watch that, you understand why the people supported Chavez. Now, I saw Chavez speak. I went to a meeting where he was speaking. I saw him talk to the masses. he had a symbiotic relation with the masses. When he spoke, he connected with them and he gained the sense of their demands. He fed it back to the people. Now, Nicolas Maduro does not have that power. Nicolas Maduro tried to keep the rich on board and the poor on board. The problem was this. After 2008, when the world economy went down, the Americans did two things. One is, they invested an enormous amount of money on fracking. And the fracking industry in America, above $40 a barrel, is cheaper than importing from the other countries. That is why America has now become self-sufficient in oil and gas. And that allowed them to lash out against Venezuela. It's allowed them to partly distance themselves from Saudi Arabia, the fracking industry. And that is how America has been put in a position where it can turn around to the rest of the world with, we don't need your oil and gas. Venezuela has the largest reserves of oil in the world. But the oil price collapsed after 2010. In 2013, when Chavez died, that's when the economy went down. But it went down because the government was trying to placate the masses by feeding, clothing, housing them, spending on social services, at the same time as the elite was gaining all the wealth from importing food, clothing, medicine, resources from abroad, because Venezuela does not produce these things. They don't produce them because the oil comes out of the ground, and that's where the wealth comes from. So the Venezuelans did not diversify their economy to produce clothing, food, medicines, and so on. And that is why Venezuelan economy, controlled not by the people, but by a tiny elite of oligarchs who own the majority of wealth in Venezuela, except for the oil wealth. They control the import of goods. So how did Maduro try and solve it? How did Chavez try and solve it? He said, we'll take two economic structures. One structure based on the Bolivarian currency, the Venezuelan currency. Another currency pegged to the dollar. So there was one hard currency and one normal currency. Everything for the people is paid in normal currency. But the hard currency is where the imported goods come from. And they need all the things that they have to live imported. Because the oil country export oil, import goods. So the consequence of that is, when they import goods, the government buys part of those goods for hard currency and sells them for the normal currency at subsidized prices to the people. When you see these queues in Venezuela to buy toilet paper, to buy milk powder, to buy basics of life, all it is the following. The government paid for those goods and subsidizes them, makes them available to the people. The people know that because they don't have a lot of money, most people know, they can only get these goods that are specially subsidized. So they go and queue. But when they get those goods, they then sell them on the black market for a price higher than the price they paid for them. And with that extra money, they get the money to buy other things that are missing. Basically, a black market is entrenched because of a dual economy created by one section controlled by the oligarchs, another section controlled by the government. Now, when the economy went down, there was less for the government. And the oligarchs seized their control and strangled the economy. And they've been systematically sabotaging. And it's logical. If I've got control over the supply of antibiotics that are imported into Venezuela, and I know that everybody's desperate for antibiotics, I can sit on them and wait till the price goes skyrocketing. I can take oil from Venezuela, drive it across the border into Colombia and sell it for 10 times the price. So nothing needs to be made. I can just buy and sell, buy and sell. That creates a hyperinflation in Venezuela. That's why you've got 1,000,000% inflation in Venezuela. If on the other side, the Venezuelan government, and I tell you this, The Americans seem to think, and these idiots, even the BBC and Jeremy Hunt and the European Union, they seem to think the people in Venezuela are idiots. No, no, no. Up until 2013, 5 years ago, Venezuelan living standards rose faster than almost any country in the world. They had healthcare, welfare, education. They even provided healthcare in America. For the American people, the poor people in the Bronx were being provided with healthcare and gas, cheap heating oil, provided by Venezuela to the Americans.
Get a word in, but
Now, the consequence of that is, is that the masses understand they may hate what Maduro has done, legitimately. But I tell you this,
1 million% inflation.
the attitude in Venezuela now is not in favour of what the Americans are doing. Look in the news reports the last couple of days, and you'll see they're getting scared. Because even those people they thought are going to side with them, when it comes down, well, they all know what happened. They all know this is organised by the Americans, by the Europeans, by the Canadians, by Bolsonaro in Brazil. They all know this, and therefore, just the same as in any situation where the independence of the country, where their own liberty, their own rights, their own dignity is under attack, they will defend their government and their country against foreign invasion and foreign interference.
So could there be another Cuban missile crisis similar to the 1962?
That's the American.
There's a talk
The
of
Americans
an
think.
invasion.
Right, the Americans are planning to finance the opposition with resources that they steal from Venezuela in America. For example, about 15% of all the petrol stations in America are owned by the Venezuelan government. Citgo it's called. They supply oil, petrol in America.
Nationalise it.
It is nationalised, but the Americans are now saying they're going to take that money from Venezuela and give it to their president in Venezuela, this guy, Guaido. Now, him and his allies will then get finance from the United States of America. They will also get finance for weapons. And what they are getting also, and the way it's going to come in now, is there is a supposed humanitarian mission from America coming to Venezuela. When they come in with this humanitarian mission, they will try and claim the Venezuelans are sabotaging humanitarian help. Then they might use some excuse to try and invade. If you notice today, this morning, mistakenly in my opinion, but Maduro said, a couple of days ago, he said, the Americans have 72 hours to leave the country, the American embassy. But the Americans refused. Because what they wanted was, like what happened, remember the Iranian hostage crisis? 1979, I believe it was. Right? What happened was, the Revolutionary Guard, as they were called in Iran, invaded the US embassy. Then the Americans sent in helicopter gunships, I believe it was, knocked down. It was an international outcry.
It took the Bank of England to save them.
So the Americans would like, they wanted to say, we recognise Guaido as the president, therefore we don't recognise the order from Maduro to leave, therefore if you invade our embassy, we will have a grounds to declare war. And so the Americans are trying to set up a scenario whereby they can invade or take military action of some sort or another.
Well,
the problem is they have completely miscalculated the balance of forces in Venezuela.
Don't forget the Russians.
People may not like Maduro, they may have suffered under, although that's not only story. Don't forget this, hyperinflation is a double-edged sword. In Venezuela, the people under Chavez were granted cheap mortgages for their houses. Cheap mortgages. So let's say you were granted a $10,000 mortgage on a house in Caracas. You might have paid 20% of your income to finance the mortgage. But when hyperinflation comes in, You can pay off the mortgage with what it costs to get a packet of a bag of potatoes. And so most people in Venezuela, because of hyperinflation, have gained the asset of their house, which they previously could never have dreamed about. Well, it's one good thing. The negative phenomena is the phenomenon of hyperinflation affecting the condition of the masses in a negative way, because they have to struggle to get food, clothing, shelter, and so on. But let's make no mistake about this. The restaurants are all full. They've got food. Right? The middle class areas, their supermarkets are full. The black market, there's goods available. There's no shortage in and of itself. There's an artificial shortage created by the economic structure. Wealth in the hands of a few, and then they talk about the mass media. Look on the mass media in Venezuela. If you can know Spanish, ask a friend who speaks Spanish. The mass media in Venezuela, about a third of it is owned by the government. The rest of it is private. They're private companies, private oligarchs, private distributors of food, private distributors of resources. And these people have been seeking to sabotage the government year in, year out.
Well, who are the 3 million people that have departed? Who are they? What are they? What are their jobs?
My cousin has left. I have family members through my cousin in Venezuela.
Tell them.
They left Venezuela.
What do they tell you?
Because the economic conditions are catastrophic for them. That's why. They feel they'll be better. No, that's not the only story. For example, my cousin or sister-in-law, my sister-in-law or cousin, sister's sister. So my sister-in-law's sister, she works as a dentist in Venezuela. She has now recently left Venezuela, gone to Colombia to join a family there. Right? Many people have family connections in Colombia anyway. The economic conditions in Colombia are better. That's why the people leave. Because it's a struggle to live in Venezuela in these conditions.
So how are you going? What's your remedy for putting it right? For goodness' sake, it's worse than Brexit, isn't it? It's a worse state than Brexit.
Yeah, the
And
first.
that's saying something.
Well, there is no state of Brexit. Brexit is a state of psychological trauma.
Well, whatever you-
There is nothing else about
however you dress
Brexit.
it up, it's
Nobody in
chaotic.
Britain, apart from people who are European, has been affected by Brexit. Nothing has happened. Nothing. Just a lot of hot air and shit.
You
talk.
wait.
Everyone talks shit to each other for 2 years.
I like it.
Otherwise, nothing has happened in relation to Brexit. People are a bit insecure, who are Europeans, for example, but otherwise nothing.
I paid my mortgage off 28 years ago.
Good for you. Now, the resolution to the problem in Venezuela is twofold. Firstly, for anything to happen that is positive in Venezuela, the coup d'etat must be defeated. And ask yourself this, remember this. I mean, Saddam Hussein, you can say what you like, he was definitely a dictator. He definitely murdered, tortured, and killed people. This is not the case in Venezuela. This is a democratically elected government, elected many, many times over. The idea that this is some dictator is a downright lie. Now, the economic circumstances of the country are terrible. Yes, they are terrible. As they were in America in the 1930s, as they have been in Greece in the last 10 years, as they are in Spain, as they have been in Iceland. Iceland was one of the richest countries in the world. Yet after 2008, the people were driven into penury. They called for the imprisonment of the bankers and government ministers. In Ireland, the economy collapsed. These are developed capitalist economies, not a backward economy. Is Venezuela the only poor country? Where are these people coming from that are going to the Mexican border? From Honduras, right? So the whole of South America is in crisis. Venezuela can get out of the crisis. 1, abolish the black market currency. 2, expropriate those companies and institutions back in the coup d'etat. Organise the distribution and import of goods by the state, not by private companies, by the state. So in other words, a state monopoly of foreign trade. And in that way they can control the resources coming in and provide them to the people. Second, Make an alliance with China to import the goods you require. China has a surplus of goods. Russia doesn't have any goods that the Venezuela needs apart from weapons.
They're building infrastructure in Venezuela.
Chinese are building the infrastructure. Well, what infrastructure can the Russians build?
Well, it's something, isn't it?
Some tiny things. The Chinese have built houses. They built railways. They built schools. Why? Because the Venezuelans had no indigenous capacity. The entire economy had been structured on the oil industry and nothing else. Now, there are many countries.
Now to get out of the ground to make it all worth it.
Venezuela has the largest supplies of oil in the world. The problem is this. They have what's called extra heavy crude, which is basically sand with oil in it. And it costs more than $40 a barrel to extract. Yet America, the United States, can produce shale gas for less than that. The consequence of that is that the world economic circumstances have pushed against the Venezuelan economy. That's why the people are suffering. But if they take over the oligarchs and they reignite the revolutionary flame, don't forget, when Chavez was in power, it began to spread. You had Bolivia, you had Ecuador, you had Nicaragua.
$100 a barrel oil.
You had Argentina, and you had $100 barrel oil. That's right.
China were very thirsty.
That's right.
They're not so thirsty
However, don't forget this. From a geostrategic long-term point of view, China has an interest, and Russia have an interest. That's partly why we see the present division. That's why the question the gentleman asked earlier on, is it another Cuban Missile Crisis? In some ways, yes. Because make no mistake about it, if they overthrow the government in Venezuela, Cuba is next. Cuba is next. Bolivia is next.
Venezuela kickstart its economy when it has no control over the price of oil.
It can do so by making an alliance with China and developing the infrastructure of the whole of South America. Don't forget this. Despite the fact that the left-wing swing began to... Argentina fell. Brazil fell. The far right have taken power in Brazil. Argentina, the same thing. And therefore the mood shifted, the swing shifted in the right-wing direction. That's what we're seeing at the moment. But on the other side, Mexico went the other way. And the Mexicans are supporting the Venezuelans. And so do not believe the story that everything is over as far as the political dynamics in Latin America are concerned.
Just kind of playing to see what happens. They haven't really picked a side. They just want to negotiate and they want to be the mediator.
The Mexicans want to maintain their economic relations with the world, but López Obrador knows fully well where this is going. The Americans, they will, as you say, they will go first Venezuela, then Cuba, then Bolivia, then Mexico. And so this is a global plan by Donald Trump and his allies to remake the world in their image. Look, but as far as the Venezuelans are concerned, what would be in their interest? Look at the people Donald Trump is scared of. You see? Kim Jong-un, that's who he's scared of. So that I don't doubt that there will be a certain mood amongst the Russians, amongst some layers amongst Nicolas Maduro's entourage, say, okay, we'll get a nuclear bomb. Like the Pakistanis have done. Or like the North Koreans have done. Some people will think like that. But I believe there will be a mass movement against the coup d'etat. And in fact, the coup d'etat, I think, will collapse. I think it's already signs it's going to collapse. Because they're talking about the revolution, the alternative president. But actually, look, where is the mass movement? And even in the BBC and the Guardian today, they're going around looking for people who are supporting the coup. They find a junior management consultant, the perfect candidate to support the coup. They turn around to him and say, what do you think? He says, I don't like Maduro, but I do not support an American coup. And everybody knows it's an American coup. I've been in Venezuela. For all the flaws in that country, it is the most politically educated people in the world. The most politically educated people in the world. For years they've understood about the threat of a coup d'etat. For years they've understood about US military activity. They followed the dynamics across the world. When America invaded Iraq, don't forget, they wanted first to overthrow Hugo Chavez. They tried to overthrow him. 48 hours they took him incarceration. They took him to an island. The Americans threw money at them. The Americans financed them. It's all been released. The information about this is publicly available. We know they organised the coup in 2002. We know they are financing and organising the present coup. So what do you really stand for? What do you really believe in? I'm not asking you to support the Venezuelan government. I'm asking you, do you believe in democratic government or not? Because I tell you this, imagine Jeremy Corbyn gets elected under whatever circumstances, maybe in January, maybe in February. If the American government says, we do not recognise you, and the European Union says, you've 8 days to call new elections, are you going to cow down and bow down and say yes? America said so. European Union said so. We've got the right to overthrow any frigging government in the world. That's what that means. The Venezuelan government has all the legitimacy of a constitutional framework within which the people can remove the president. Last year's presidential election was a recall election, called by signatures from the people. We don't have that right here. They had that right. They took that right. And I repeat, last year's election in Venezuela was monitored by the former Prime Minister of Spain, Zapatero. And he declared the election was free and fair. No irregularities, or none to speak of. And therefore, the idea that this is some legitimate removal of an undemocratic government, authoritarian, is a lie from beginning to end. Defend Venezuela, defend the people of Venezuela to decide their own government, to choose their own government, and stop the actions of the Europeans, of the British, of the Americans, of the Canadians who claim to be democratic and are using every mechanism they can to overthrow the democratic elected government of Venezuela. Hands off Venezuela, long live the Venezuelan revolution.
Very passionate man. Thank you.
If anyone's got any questions about what I was discussing, you're welcome to ask and I'll try and answer. Anybody?
Well, it's interesting.
Okay, thanks very much.
Content of everything from your humanity.
Man, say it straight. Man, don't listen to BBC. Man, don't listen to ITV.
You hate the Jewish state. You hate the Jewish religion. You couldn't bring yourself to say one positive thing about the Jewish religion. Say one positive thing about the Jewish religion. So give us a positive thing that you like about it.
Definitely not you.
What?
Definitely not you, mate.
Well, yeah, give us an example of one of those good things. What humanity? Well, give us an example of that from the scripture.
Not the case about Israel. Israel, you can't get educated.